Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to start this brief session with a question. I just want to know how many of you involve your children or maybe young people that you teach with the bushcraft that you practice yourselves. Show of hands. Yeah?
Kind of training.
Sorry?
Kind of training from that angle. Yeah.
Training, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I wonder then, is it easy necessarily to supervise children if they're, well, not necessarily just children, but people you're working with, if you've got to bear in mind that they've got knives or around fire, or they might eat something that isn't good for them? Is it always easy and stress-free to teach that kind of thing?
I think you've got a good adult-child ratio. Yes, that's quite paramount.
Yeah. So there are concerns we have to make sure we're supervising, but if there is this risk of them maybe burning themselves or cutting themselves, there must be some other benefit that we're considering when we're actually doing these activities. We think it's going to do them good, don't we? Because otherwise we'd just follow W.C. Field's advice and never work with children or animals. It would be much easier, wouldn't it? But I think there are benefits, and some of the research that I've done that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, hopefully, I think it would be a bit over the top to say it's proved it, but it's certainly indicated that there are benefits to this kind of activities. Otherwise you wouldn't get experiences like this. I have permission to use these pictures. My children are in the front row, so that's them. Things like getting them involved with foraging, so they're foraging for shaggy parasol mushrooms. Here Michael's made a little stick figure with his knife. Or building shelters. Cooking on a campfire. This was a session that I did. The first sort of piece of research I did into using bushcraft in an educational setting was with a group of special needs, or several special needs groups in 2011. I was trying to find out whether real world experience, so bushcraft would work in the programs that they were studying, and they were studying things like how to make the most of their leisure time, environmental awareness, working as a team, and I wanted to use bushcraft as an activity to support the studies that they were doing. And in this picture we had identified a number of different umbellifers, so plant species that have that umbrella-shaped spray of flowers on the top, things like cowpath. And what we've done here, this was later in the year when we were just looking at the stems and the remnants of leaves and sort of seed clusters and things to identify them. And we've gone through a few different species, and they collected some hogweed seeds, we ground them up, and we've made hogweed biscuits. Taste a bit like gingerbread, they're really nice. And then they cooked them, each cooked an individual biscuit on a shovel over the fire. I also did some other activities with them, so the picture of the shelter earlier on was one that they had built. We did some tracking. I was lucky enough to work at an agricultural college at the time where I specialised in countryside management. So we were able to go out onto the estate, and we could actually track some of the deer species that Jason and the Woodland Laser team were talking about earlier. We tracked some muntjac and we tracked some roe. We were also able to track badgers and things like that, and involve those bushcraft skills, countryside skills, practically with their curriculum. We did some other cooking things, so we were making orange ash cakes there. And then this was something we did at the end of the year, just before Christmas. We had a big cook up. We were cooking quail there that we had reared, and obviously that we got a marshmallow garnish for those quail as well. Beyond that, though, as part of that study, I looked at the feedback from the teachers that would normally teach those children, and their own feedback as well as to how they thought it went. And I got some really, really positive feedback. So the staff that would normally teach them, that taught them in their day-to-day educational programs, were saying that they engaged really well with these activities. Then the normal part of their countryside program would involve things like building fences and coppicing and things like that. But this slightly, I suppose, more novel approach to it, different activities that they could do, something a bit more adventurous. They felt they engaged really well with it, more so than they normally would. Which was what I was looking at. I was looking to design programs that would help those students engage with learning. That got me thinking, okay, if I can use this to engage people, can I actually use it to boost academic attainment or to help people in academic studies as well? So not just personal. So what kind of personal development comes from getting involved in bushcraft? What things are people learning?
Self-esteem.
Self-esteem, definitely.
Survival,
Yeah.
self-sufficiency.
Yeah. So if they know actually I can light a fire myself.
You can't look after yourself, you can't look after anybody else.
Yeah. So you look at helping other people as well. Yeah. Thank you. How about things then like dexterity, things like that? If you're whittling, or maybe plaiting a cord or a bracelet or something out of natural cordage, you're going to develop those fine motor skills and dexterity. So those are some of those personal benefits either physically or emotionally or socially that you're getting from being involved in these kind of activities. Now, the first thing I thought was that I teach countryside management, I have a specialism in gamekeeping and deer management and environmental education. It's really easy for me to think, actually I can see overlaps between bushcraft and some of the subjects I teach. For example, one of the modules that I teach my gamekeeping students is trapping, pest and predator control. So they learn how to use snares, they learn how to use traps. It's part of the industry that they're about to enter, and it's something they learn, and I can see links between bushcraft and that. Other links, green woodwork. So they learn how to coppice, they learn how to process green wood materials that they harvest, whether that's making hurdles for sheep fencing or duck baskets or anything like that, or even pole lays and things like that. Dressing game. Yeah, they have to learn an element of meat handling and hygiene. That's a Chinese water deer. Being skinned, it's already been gralloped and had the intestines and the rumen removed. So my students get involved with that. They also get involved with the use of firearms and taking game, and pests and predators like foxes. So I could see links immediately between the subject that I specialised in and bushcraft, and I thought, right, this is a great opportunity for me to test it. Can I teach my students using some bushcraft activities? Because normally, if they're going to learn plant identification, they'll get a bunch of RD guides, and they will go out and look at the trees. They'll learn the form of the leaves. They'll look at them in winter. But what they won't do is actually use it for anything other than the green woodwork things. They're not going to go and make cord out of a lime tree, and they're not going to make cord out of willow bark and things like that. So I thought, right, I'm going to do that. I'm going to use bushcraft to do some more than what they would normally do. But first I had to justify it, not only to my employer. If I was going to say, right, I'm going to teach these guys using bushcraft, they're not going to do their normal lessons. They're going to cover the normal material, but they're going to do it differently. I had to justify that to them, and I had to justify it to myself as well. It's no good to me just saying, right, I really enjoy bushcraft, so I'm going to teach it because it's great. Wouldn't really go down well in the colleges that I teach at. And in justifying it, this acronym, TEKW, stands for Traditional Ecological Knowledge and Wisdom. That saved my life in terms of justifying it and finding a use or an application. Traditional ecological knowledge and wisdom includes the knowledge of indigenous peoples, how they would have lived their lives, maybe their hunting and foraging techniques, maybe some of their knowledge of the ecology and climate and ecosystems that they lived in. And it encompasses a huge range of different things, just like bushcraft does. And I've got a few references. I didn't realise how small it would appear on here. If you are specifically interested in some of these references, catch me at the end, and I can make sure you get them if you can't see them on here. We've got a paper by Omagari and Burks, who wrote about fur preparation, hunting, fishing, and trapping. These aren't the titles of the papers. This is just a sort of very brief synopsis of what they talked about. Critch Wright Fraser, making skin clothing. Yeah, that's really tiny on there, sorry about that. Beckford and Barker wrote about traditional skills and the knowledge of farmers. Pearce and a number of other authors studied specifically polar bear hunting. And then a whole number of authors here wrote, basically concluded, among other things, that traditional knowledge and methods are still valid even when we consider modern farming and technology and the science behind it. And then lastly, Ellis in 2005 wrote about how traditional knowledge can or possibly even should influence environmental decision making. So when we're taking decisions about areas that should be granted special protection, either as areas of conservation or for whatever reason, the indigenous knowledge and the environmental knowledge of traditional environmental knowledge should be taken into account and could still be relevant. So that was some of the backing that I used to say, look, bushcraft is actually relevant. Although none of these studies really originate in the UK, there's plenty of evidence that it's being done in other places. So this traditional knowledge, bushcraft, can be used in education. From an educational theory point of view, I referred in justifying this to a theory called constructivism, which talks about how the way we learn, or the way we might learn, is by forming links between information we already have or information that we learn, and those links that we create help us remember it and apply it and use the information. So in terms of the plant identification, which is the project I started with here, normally my countryside management students learn a few things about plants. They'll learn the form, shape of the leaves, shape of the tree. They'll learn about the habitat, so they'll say it's a really wet place, so we might expect willow and alder and things like that there. They'll learn even the difference of geographical locations where they might likely find something. They'll learn about the colour. They'll learn basically the physical properties of that plant, and that's how they'll identify it. And they form those links, and that's how they identify their plants. With bushcraft, my suggestion was that actually we're teaching them more about it, so we're making more of these links, and maybe that will help them remember it. So we might teach them about its suitability as a firewood. We might teach them about its edibilities. They might go on to eat these plants or make food out of them, and uses of it. So cordage, they'll make cord out of any number of different species, and they'll use them for different craft projects. They might even make a friction fire set out of elder or something like that. And then we create links with all these new bits of information that they wouldn't normally have gained over the course of the countryside management programme, and hopefully they can remember it better. And that's what this next sort of project that I ran focused on, doing some bushcraft to support the normal learning. What I couldn't say was we're doing it instead. They have to do their normal sort of more sort of mainstream ID type learning, but we could do these other things as well. I got permission to go ahead with that. And so that sort of constructivism theory, we're talking about joining dots, linking different pieces of knowledge that we have. The final point that I used to justify bushcraft was engagement. My earlier study in 2011 had indicated, although they were small cohorts of students, that they did engage really well with bushcraft activities, slightly more adventurous activities outside. And engagement, all we're talking about here is whether they're willing to get stuck in. If you engage with an activity, you're stuck into it, you're involved, you are doing the activity, you're taking part in it as fully as you can. And it's been suggested that if we're getting stuck into an activity, if we're engaged with it, that increases our attention and mental effort. If you're not interested, you're not going to listen, you're not going to take part fully, you're not going to gain as much from the experience as you could. So if we're engaging students, learners, participants, whatever we want to call them, if we're engaging them with whatever it is we're teaching, they are more likely to learn from it. And my other sort of justification was, look, this will engage them. That's something that's we can be sure of. Even if it doesn't teach them anything, it will engage them and they will work hard, so they have to learn something from it. Okay, so this project that I was justifying was going to be a piece of actual research. So I was using it to inform my own teaching practice. I'd carry out this project where I would teach plant identification using bushcraft, and I would then maybe change the way that I teach as a result of that. And the basic hypothesis of this is the null hypothesis. So I had to prove this statement wrong. So supporting lessons on plant and tree identification with bushcraft does not affect student attainment. I obviously wanted to prove the opposite, but as part of this project I had to come up with this null hypothesis and prove it wrong using a statistical test. I'll get to the average test scores in a minute. The way I carried out this experiment was I had two cohorts of countryside management students. They both studied plant identification as part of several modules that they studied that came into their woodland habitat management module, came into an organism identification module that they studied, and it was also applied throughout various other modules, like estate skills, where they have to carry out habitat management. They have to be able to identify invasive plant species. They have to be able to identify the plant species, maybe in a hedgerow that they are laying or cutting or managing. They have to identify, whether it's a species-rich hedge or not. So they need to identify, at least 5 different species over an average of 30 metres to class what kind of hedge it is. So they have to have quite a good knowledge of plants. Anyway, that's part of the subject and industry they're entering. Just to clarify, the level of students that I was teaching at this stage, these were level 3 extended diploma students, so it's the equivalent of A-levels. An extended diploma is worth 3 A-levels in terms of its number of UCAS points and the amount of time it takes to achieve it. So I had these 2 cohorts of students. One would not receive any additional bushcraft tuition at all. They would do their normal plant ID sessions. They do their normal sessions where they apply their knowledge of plants. And they would just have their sort of normal year. The other students would receive additional bushcraft sessions with me. And we did edibility of plants. So we, when they started college at the very end of summer, we went and looked at burdock. We dug burdock up. We made chips out of its roots. We did all sorts of things like that. We made rope that was strong enough for them to lift up their toolboxes with that they used for their practicals. So we did a lot of things where they applied bushcraft knowledge to their plant identification and learned more about the plants than they would normally. And what I was hoping was to prove that this extra bushcraft knowledge, what they were doing extra, was actually going to help them remember it. What I didn't want was this to be rote learning, and that's what would happen a lot of the time. They'd learn out of a field guide that hawthorn had such and such a shaped leaf, it flowered at such and such a time, oak looked like this, ash looked like that, and they would remember it based on the field guide. So if they spotted something that wasn't quite like it, they'd struggle. Whereas the bushcraft sessions got them involved at different times of the year. It got them involved looking more closely at the different species and having to identify them confidently enough to say, yeah, I'm going to eat that now. So it was a bit more focused and on the plant and its features, and actually using it as well. So if we look at the average test scores of these 2 groups, what I did was each group was tested based on 16 plant species. It was a practical test. They weren't identifying them from photographs or laminated leaves in a textbook. I took them out on an identical walk off the college estate, and they identified 16 different plant species for me from around the estate in a number of different areas. Some of them were picked from hedgerows, some of them were growing in the grass of our arboretum, and it included, I didn't actually write the list of plants, so I tested them on down, but it included plantains, it included hawthorn, elder, yarrow, and a number of others, but sort of ones that are commonly found in the UK anyway. It was no crazy sort of non-native species, and we weren't looking at specific grass species, so we weren't identifying, doing really fine identification on grasses. So the non-bushcraft cohort scored an average test score of 57%, which was pretty disappointing for a group of countryside management students, to be honest. And the bushcraft cohort, so the ones who had extra bushcraft tuition, scored an average of 83 over all the learners in that cohort. Now, although I think the percentages kind of speak for themselves, for the project I had to do a statistical test called the t-test to compare two sets of results and prove that there was a significant difference, and it did come out and say that these two sets of results were significantly different, thereby disproving the null hypothesis and saying that yes, this, whatever it was that we did actually made a difference. Yeah. So I think, you know, it looks as a result of this like bushcraft can help people, even if it was just that it was helping them remember little bits about the plants, rather than it didn't necessarily make them better at identification, but it maybe helped them remember the things they needed to know to be better at identification. In terms of representing this graphically, what this graph represents is the opinions of the students that were in these cohorts. So they study, each year of their course, they study 9 different modules. And I questioned them on which they felt could be supported by bushcraft. So if they were studying and bushcraft was integrated into their course, which modules would it help? Now, there's not 9 different options on there, because there were some they thought it was completely irrelevant to, so they have to do a functional skills module, which is all maths and English. They didn't see any relevance there. They also didn't see any relevance with their investigative project module, which involves them picking a topic within the industry that they're involved with and doing sort of a mini dissertation, a sort of school level dissertation. And things like fishery management, they also do. They didn't see any relevance there, but if you can't read those, which I realise you possibly can't because it's so small. Principles of wildlife, population, ecology and conservation appears as this blue one here. So they thought that was pretty relevant. Estate skills, where they do practical projects, habitat management, things like that, they thought that was quite relevant. Vertebrate pest and predator control, so there's the trapping again. So we did some extra tracking and things like that to help them identify where to put traps that they felt was relevant. Greenwood craft, which they felt was the most relevant one, so they did knife skills and things like that. They felt was really something that crossed over particularly well from bushcraft. And then woodland management they thought was relevant as well. So the reason I sort of presented this graph was to say that actually not only have I managed to justify it for the college to let me go ahead with it in the first place, but the students felt it was relevant, they were engaging with it and they thought it was useful. Finally, I did a questionnaire with the students to see what they thought, not only of what modules they thought were relevant, but to gauge their interest and some other feelings they had about the study that we did. So question 1 on here was, bushcraft is not part of the required curriculum of the countryside management course, but studying it equips you with skills you could use in a career in the countryside. If they had chosen that they disagreed or strongly disagreed, we'd see a green and a purple bar here, but we've got that all students were in agreement, either strongly or less strongly, but they all agreed that they could see uses for the skills that I was teaching them in their later careers. On questioning them more fully, they said, well actually yeah, we're going to work in country parks, and if you look at the number of country parks that are doing bushcraft days or survival skill days, there's loads of them because they need to be engaging visitors. Although I teach mostly gamekeeping students, you know, maybe 50% of the students I teach are going to go into careers where they have to engage with visitors to the countryside, whether it's to parks, to private estates, national trust sites, wildlife trust sites. They're going to have to engage them. And bushcraft is an excellent activity. If you've got a school group coming to a nature reserve and you need to put on an activity, why not do some tracking, friction firelighting, or you know, anything like that. And they thought they could apply that possibly more strongly than anything else. Secondly then, is it easy to engage and take part in bushcraft activities? So I return to that question that I first asked in 2011. Is it engaging? Does it help students engage and get stuck into their classes? So we've got again here, strongly agree and agree. I'll mention some limitations on the next slide, but I have my doubts as to how honest some of these students were, because there was one who I know for a fact preferred sweeping the gamekeeping workshop's floor than doing a flint knapping session that I did with them. So whether he was entirely honest when he said he agreed he engaged with it, I'm not sure. Question 3 then was, bushcraft is a more engaging topic than other topics you study at college. I was on a bit of dicey ground when I asked this because I knew I had to tell my other teaching colleagues the answer to this one, and I didn't want, wasn't trying to do them out of a job. But it turns out they all strongly agreed, so I was quite happy with the response to that in the end. 4th then, knowing about the properties, and this was a specific question related to that plant ID study I did. Knowing about the properties and uses of certain plants and trees has enhanced your ability to identify them. And again, we can see that they all strongly agreed with that. They felt the extra stuff we did, whether it was making string, whether it was doing edible plants and things like that, it did actually help them. They used that information and they could ID plants better as a result. And then finally 5, the basic skills of bushcraft, such as using a knife or saw, have helped you in your studies, and again they all agreed with that, which was particularly relevant to things like their green woodwork modules and estate skills modules. So I was quite pleased with the results of that. It justified in many ways, if the justifications I hadn't given to begin with were enough, that justified to me and to my employer, who was quite happy with the results of this, that what I was doing actually did have an effect. It was worth trying at the very least. I said I'd mention some limitations because there were some. It wasn't all. There isn't enough here to say yes, bushcraft should be included in everything we teach. This looked at a tiny snapshot, just a tiny snapshot of countryside management education, let alone education as a whole. Specifically plant ID, they study a whole range of topics that I didn't cover in the study. Handling carcasses and meat hygiene and things like that, which is a very specific element that this didn't even touch on. So I can only say that this has any impact on my teaching of plant ID. I can't say that I've proved that it's helped them in any other area of their study. Other limitations, I'm dealing with very small cohorts. Countryside management, although a lot of land-based colleges teach it, we still deal with fairly small cohorts of students. The college I teach at the moment, we have 24 students on the countryside management programme, and I have 10 students on my gamekeeping programme. We have about 60 students on the arboriculture and tree surgery courses, but it's tiny numbers in the grand scheme of things. In terms of education, they're very, very small sample sizes, so there are limitations, and the significance of those results could potentially be questioned because of the tiny sample sizes. So because of those limitations and because of my continued interest in the topic, I've looked at additional projects I can do, things that I can study in the future that may fill up some of those gaps. So some of those research projects include, this is something I'm going to kick off very shortly. I'm delivering a workshop at a forest schools event in Northamptonshire in a couple of weeks' time. And I'll have a captive audience of a load of forest schools leaders. So I'm going to launch this project then. I'm going to look at how does the use of knives and tools by children develop dexterity and fine motor skills. I really don't like the idea that we see commonly in the press and basically everywhere you look or read that knives are weapons, horrible things, that no one should have them, especially not children. I think under the right supervision and in the right context, children should have access to knives. They should learn how to respect them, they should learn how to use them, because ultimately there is no more useful universal tool than a knife. They're going to need to learn to use one to cut vegetables in the kitchen at some point. They should have a wholesome relationship with the knife as a tool, not as some kind of weapon that they see on the news or are told is a horrible or heinous thing, that is nasty. And I'd like to try and see if that using knives develops dexterity. I'm personally convinced that it does. If you think about all the fine motor movements that are required in whittling something, or even just controlling a knife to cut string, convinced it can help. And I'm talking about prolonged programs of use here, so not a one-off event, because I don't think that can be deemed significant at all. But if we're talking about a forest schools program that might be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 30 weeks long, depending on the school that's delivering it or getting involved, that's a significant period of time over which those skills can develop. I'd like to look specifically at that. Another thing I'm really interested in looking at is this, and I made this word up, so it probably doesn't mean anything to anyone else, but there's a term in education, especially experiential learning, of mediation. So facilitation, mediation, teaching, basically, if an experience is mediated, then something or someone is modifying that experience to help you learn from it. So it might be just a case of me teaching my son that he shouldn't eat mushrooms that are a certain colour or whatever, that I'm mediating that experience, I'm helping him interpret it and modifying it so he understands it. Mediation can also be carried out by the use of textbooks, so you don't have to have a teacher there. If you are looking at a textbook, that textbook is your mediation and learning experience. It's modifying the information to the point where you can hopefully understand it and apply it. But I'm thinking about unmediated learning here, so it's learning that you carry out of your own trial and error. Because I think a lot of people learn bushcraft that way. There may be people who can't afford to go on courses or who don't want to go on courses and who are quite happy to rub sticks together in their back garden until they have produced fire. It's that kind of unmediated learning that I'm really interested in looking at, whether it's, you know, specifically whether that learning is as valuable or can it do something different. And I did look at that in a more recent project, which I'll touch on in just a minute. But that's something I'm really quite interested in, partly because I could never afford to go on bushcraft courses when I was younger, and I didn't rub sticks together in my back garden until I made fire. An early sort of result of that idea of unmediation was a project I carried out and submitted in partial fulfilment of a module towards a Master's degree in Outdoor Education that I'm currently studying, and produced this pamphlet, which is going to be available on Kindle in a few weeks' time. I did a study with a group of students. This is last year, between October and December. Over a 6-week period, they learned to light fires by friction. But what I didn't want to do was sit down with them individually and say, this is how you do it, this is the position you adopt, this is the wood you use. What I wanted them to do was see a demonstration, get a little bit of information, and then do it by trial and error, and produce learning logs. So they had little booklets where they would track their experiences over the course of a few weeks. They'd start off with, this was what I did, this is how I interpreted it. So it could be that I rubbed these two sticks together using a bow drill for 15 minutes, and I produced loads of smoke and it all turned black and I didn't get fired. What am I going to do about it? And they might think, well, actually maybe the wood I'm using isn't right, or maybe it's a bit damp. And they would then modify their approach over the period of time to produce fire. And what I was hoping to find was that rather than, if I'd sat there, they may have made fire faster, but they wouldn't have known so much about the process of lighting fire. They may not have known that actually if I'm getting more smoke from my hand, all I need to do is sharpen the top of the drill a bit, maybe take a slice off the bearing block I'm using, less friction at the top, less heat, less smoke, and it's going to be easier for me to spin that drill. So what I was hoping was that they'd come up with that themselves without me sitting there and saying, change this, change that, there you've done it. And as a result, we did some workshops after the sessions where they'd been practicing, where they would put up on a whiteboard what they, this is an obstacle I faced and this is how I overcame it. And it was things like, I couldn't spin the drill, so I put something in the bearing block to lubricate it. So I stuck some leaves in there, I stuck a slug in there, that was one that happened, and sticking slugs and snails in the bearing blocks there, friction fire kits. One of them even put chainsaw oil in there, which smelled really bad, but it did do the trick. Different woods that they tried, different sort of positions to balance all the components of the bow drill set together, different teamwork approaches, so where maybe one didn't feel he or she could actually produce the necessary pressure and work on the bow fast enough. They teamed up and they discussed how they could best hold it all in the right position. And as a result of that study, I produced a small pamphlet, and it's based on their feedback sessions where they wrote all their things up on the board. I've I've put their tips and my experience together in this little pamphlet, and that was, other than fulfilling the requirements of this assignment for my masters, it was great fun as well. And that was with a group of students from Malton College, where I taught up until December last year.
Sorry, where did you teach?
That was Malton College, Northampton.
So, no, I'm only asking because I went to Ecological College many years ago and did countryside management.
Oh, right.
That's at Derbyshire.
And then the last one is Bush Class, a project I'm working on at the moment. A few years ago, I taught environmental education to forest schools and bushcraft sessions for Duke Veterans Award groups, school groups and things like that. And something I prepared, which I realise must be absolutely minute up there, was a list of curriculum links between the activities I was delivering and the national curriculum at the time. Partly to prove to schools that actually, yeah, I'm going to hit some of the targets you want your students to reach, so you shouldn't appoint me. And partly as a thing to say, look, we can actually integrate environmental education, bushcraft and things like that into the school curriculum. It's not just a lunchtime dinner club or an after-school club, it's actually relevant and will help. With the new sort of primary and secondary school curriculum goes live, for want of a better word, this coming academic year in September. So I'm looking at reviewing this, renewing it and adding detail to it. This is just key stage 2 and 3, so primary school and the first few years of secondary school. But I'm going to be looking at more links to different elements of the curriculum. This one just links geography and science curriculum. I'm going to be looking at things like PE, history and things like that, how I can link bushcraft to other things, even down to a more scientific level. So some of the things like the science of tanning a deer skin, using that in classrooms or outside the classrooms in the school grounds would be even better. That's another project that I'm working on at the moment, which brings my presentation to a close. Oh yeah, contributions. So I'm not asking for money. Although if you want to give me any, that would be great. What I would like though is for anyone who feels they have an opinion on any of these things that I've mentioned, or who would be willing to contribute to any research in the future, to get in touch. That's probably completely invisible, but if you do think that you'd like to contribute to anything or would like to receive any sort of surveys or anything that I'll be working on in the future, if you grab me for a second afterwards, I can give you my details, because yeah, I can't even see that from here. Yeah, if you feel that you'd like to contribute or can contribute, then I would be most grateful. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, shoot.
Well, from the research you've done, do you think that other agricultural colleges will bear that in mind and use bushcraft on their countryside management courses?
On a limited scale, I can say definitely, because since I did the friction fire research and the research on the plant idea at Malton College, I've changed jobs and I now teach at Bushcraft College in Cheshire, and they do, possibly because I've got there and told them it's a great idea, but we've actually just very recently, last week, actually accredited a short basic bushcraft course, which we'll be delivering to countryside management students as an additional qualification, specifically to help them engage visitors if they work in sort of sites where they have visitors. So yeah, there is scope for it, and I'd like to see it grow. Yes?
I was just wondering why it is to think all of a sudden, like, bushcraft skills are everywhere, and survival skills are everywhere, and it's on TV now, there's guys on the island and stuff like that, and I just thought, I think I maybe know the answer, it's like a backlash to the technology age now. Our kids spend hours and hours sitting on their bums on their technology, so it's just a way to kind of, you know, energetically get them out there. Yeah. And all of a sudden, everywhere you go, it's all about bushcraft skills. Yeah, I think it's awesome. It wasn't when I was a kid, we had bushcraft skills.
No, I think it's great, and it actually raises something I did with that same special needs group that I mentioned, the first piece of research I did. Something I did with them normally was we'd take a video camera much like that one, go out and film that sort of signs of spring or signs of autumn. And we did one of these activities once. We filmed all the buds bursting and the new shoots coming up. I said, look, I'm going to edit this into a video next week. You're going to look at it. I never had a classroom with that group, so we watched it on an iPad sitting in the woods. But it took them about 15 seconds before they were more interested in the birds in the trees above them than this video. It was great making it, but actually watching it held no interest, which I thought was fun. It didn't really do my lesson planning any good, but realistically it was great. They were more interested in actually being in the outdoors environment than looking at something on a little screen, which I felt was brilliant. That was fantastic. Any other questions?
So what age were the young people that you work, the people that you work with? What kind of age? Were they primary, secondary age? Or
All
they
the projects,
wanted the learning difficulties?
they were post-compulsory education, so they're all 16 plus.